This is the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Friday, February 3rd, 2017, where I introduce 5 podcasts, hopefully new podcasts to you, in around 5 minutes. Well, usually it's a bit more than 5 minutes, but less than 10 minutes. But however long it takes, the links to all 5 podcasts are on your screen, so no need to take notes, just carry on with what you're doing. So the first podcast is the Osher Gunsberg podcast. Now, Osher Gunsberg is known to most Australians as the host of the Australian version of The Bachelor and the former host of Australian Idol, as well as a string of other TV shows and breakfast radio programs. Now, in the mainstream broadcast world, he's the polished commercial TV and breakfast radio host and, well, kind of has the not too deep personality that goes with that. However, listening to the Osher Gunsberg podcast, and I think this is one of the interesting things about podcasts, we get to hear the real Osher behind the TV personality. You know, people say radio is an intimate medium, but I reckon podcasts beat radio hands down. So the Osher Gunsberg podcast is essentially an interview, or perhaps I should say discussion podcast, and I'll get to that in a moment. But in the opening minutes of most episodes of the Osher Gunsberg podcast, Osher gives us a bit of a candid update on what's been going on in his life, and often this is about where he's at with his mental health. On the podcast, Osher is very open about his struggles with mental health, and particularly anxiety. Now, whether you suffer from anxiety or not, you should find it genuinely enlightening to hear Osher talk about his experience on an episode-by-episode basis. But just to be clear, the Osher Gunsberg podcast is primarily a discussion podcast, and I think discussion sounds like the better word than interview, with over 100 episodes so far. You really need to scroll the episode list and pick off the interviewees, or should I say discussionees, that interest you. Since the time the Osher Gunsberg podcast has existed, Osher has lived in both Australia, mainly in Sydney, and in the US in LA and back again in Australia. So guests are from all over the place. And although there's an Australian skew, the discussions are generally relevant wherever you are. Anyhow, check out the Osher Gunsberg podcast episode list using the link on your screen, and at least sample an episode or two. If you're an Australian and know Osher from his TV and radio appearances, you'll hear a different and much deeper version of him on the Osher Gunsberg podcast. Okay, next podcast is The Feed. And The Feed is really a podcast for people who make podcasts. It's produced by Libsyn, one of the largest podcast hosts. Now, if you're a podcaster, you'll know what that means, and you're probably aware of Libsyn. If you're not a podcaster, then podcast hosting in this sense means the company where you lodge your podcast for distribution to iTunes, Stitcher, and all the other places you can download podcasts from. Anyhow, the point is that the Feed podcast, being produced by Libsyn, has a huge amount of information on the behind the scenes of podcasting. Each episode covers the latest news relevant to podcasters and a whole lot of tips and tricks to optimize your podcast and grow your audience. Probably the most popular segment on each episode of The Feed is the stats segment, which gives a monthly update on podcast download numbers. So typically the only podcast you know the download numbers for is your own podcast. So hearing the aggregated monthly numbers for all Libsyn-hosted podcasts is kind of like hearing where you sit on the scoreboard. Here's a short clip from the stats segment of The Feed, and maybe the numbers will surprise you.
Now, here are some real numbers to measure up against to see where your show falls in. And again, to put things in perspective, if your episodes are getting 200 downloads after 30 days, you are better than half the shows. If you're more than 1,700, you're better than 80% of the shows. More than 5,400, you're better than 90% of the shows. More than 13,000, you're better than 95% of the shows. More than 36,000, then you are better than 98% of the shows. If you're more than 75,000, you're better than 99% of the shows. And those numbers were all up compared to previous months. That said, with all the new shows in January, it's likely to push all those numbers down when we do next month's report, and then the month after that, and the month after that.
Okay, that's The Feed, and you'll find the link on your screen. Third podcast this episode is Death, Sex and Money. What can I say? It's a great title, and I know many of you will be well aware of Death, Sex and Money. Since it launched mid-2014, it's been a regular on top podcast lists. The host and creator of the podcast, Anna Sale, wanted to create an interview-style podcast with a difference, one that created an environment where guests and the host could feel okay to tackle the taboo subjects, to talk about the things that are usually, as they put it, left out of polite conversation. So guests are a mix of celebrities and non-celebrities, but each with an interesting story to tell, maybe one that they haven't told publicly before. A good way into Death, Sex and Money is to sample an episode with a recognised guest, like, for instance, Alec Baldwin or Brooke Shields, and it's odds on you'll hear a different side to them. But most episodes, celebrity or not, are interesting conversations driven by the often almost voyeuristic aspect of hearing people open up more than is usually done, as they say, in polite company. If you haven't got into Death, Sex and Money yet, definitely check it out using the link on your screen. Next up is The Dollop, and I'm going to say right up front, I'm not a huge fan of The Dollop. I've given a few episodes a go, but just can't get into it. It's not for me, but that's okay. The Dollop is for plenty of people. It's got a cult following in both the US and Australia, and live versions of The Dollop play to sold-out crowds in both these countries. So what's The Dollop about? Well, basically it's two comedians, Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds, who are the hosts and creators of The Dollop. Each episode, Dave reads a story, usually some obscure and bizarre story from American or sometimes Australian history. He reads it to Gareth, who has no idea what the story's about. And from that, as they say, hilarity ensues. I definitely need to play a clip for that to really make sense. This clip is from what many consider to be one of the classic episodes of The Dollop. The episode is called The Rube, and it's the story of a legendary but apparently not too bright US baseball player from the 1890s.
Okay, so this is the best. This is the most well-known fact about Rube Waddell.
Okay.
If a fire truck went by the stadium...
I'm going to need to stop you. I doesn't matter what the rest of the statement is.
Right.
This is a problem.
Okay. If a fire truck went by the stadium, he would chase it.
No!
Every time.
What?
He would always chase a fire truck.
I'm starting to
No
think...
matter where it was.
Does he maybe have a dog brain? He likes puppies, shiny things get him, and fire trucks.
Well, he wasn't formally educated.
Yeah, but still, does your brain become a canine brain? He would only eat out of bowls on the floor. He had to have a little door in his regular door to crawl outside to go make boom.
Oh, God. I would love to see that. Just him running out of the stadium and all the players like, oh, fuck.
I mean, if the manager would be like, look, if we can get through today with no fire trucks, no puppies, no shiny objects, and he doesn't want to go fishing, we got a shot.
So that's The Dollop. The guys are prolific, having pumped out around 2 episodes a week for years. So there's a ton of episodes to scan through and pick off if The Dollop's your thing. But if you want an entry point into The Dollop, continue listening to episode 12 on the Rube. I put a link to that specific episode as well as to the main Dollop feed on your screen. Okay, last podcast this episode is Hidden Brain. Each episode of Hidden Brain looks at an aspect of our psychology that unconsciously drives our behaviour. For example, one episode asks the question about the clothes you're wearing and to what extent you decided on your clothes versus the subconscious impact of things like product placement or peer influence. Another episode called What Are the Odds looks at how our brains struggle with processing statistics and chance. The host, Shankar Vedantam, is an experienced science journalist and so is very good at translating the often complex psychology and neurobiology into plain speak. Hidden Brain is interesting listening, but beyond just being interesting listening, it's aiming to give insights into the hidden workings of our brains that we can apply at work or at home or in life generally. Episodes of Hidden Brain drop pretty much weekly and you can check them out using the link on your screen. Okay, that's just about it for this episode. If you ever want to get in touch with a comment, question, or maybe a podcast suggestion, I'm on email at 5minutepodcastreview@gmail.com. That's the numeral 5, though the easiest way is just to use the email link that's also on your screen. See you in the next episode. Thanks for listening.